Good morning, everyone. Delighted to have a wonderful congregation of learners together in cyberspace on this very chilly Groundhog Day. I hope that your Groundhog Day is meaningful. I'm taking it from the fact that the sun is out, and I don't know what things are like in Punxsutawney, but I assume Mr. Groundhog saw his shadow.
He saw his shadow. We have 6 more weeks of winter. Maybe we'll finally get winter.
Yeah, right. Well, the next few days are going to feel a lot like winter. So there you go. One of the great holidays, Groundhog Day, and one of the great movies too, by the way. In keeping with the theme of the movie Groundhog Day, the great Bill Murray film vehicle, this lesson may feel like Groundhog Day to some of our learners in that it is a text that I've taught before in excerpt on a couple of different occasions over a period of many years. Most recently, I believe that I shared this text on Tisha B'Av, on the 9th of Av. So that doesn't exactly draw a huge congregation. So I assumed that even if you've encountered Tractate Sukkah 51, 51a and b, this is not going to be familiar to all. And even if you've encountered a little bit of it before, seeing it in its original context is really going to be interesting for us. Join me as we bless Baruch Ata Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. So once again, good morning. We are going to be learning Tractate Sukkah from the Babylonian Talmud. It should not surprise you that this is the section of the Talmud about the holiday of Sukkot and all of the rules and regulations that go into Sukkot. Why are we doing Sukkot in the middle of February? Because this is an introduction to Talmud where the goal is not to proceed sequentially or calendrically, but rather to give us a working facility with the forms of rabbinic argument and the themes and concerns of the Babylonian Talmud. So this is just a survey class. I'm delighted, by the way, to let you know that after a brief late winter hiatus, so our class today is lesson 4 of 5. This is a 5-week introduction. I know that will feel like just an appetizer-sized portion for many of us who are so devoted to our Thursday morning learning. But in order to allow me sufficient time to prepare these lessons, and also because February President's Week break is coming up and I will be traveling to Israel during that break. So I'm going to be gone from the 18th of this month until the 26th. I arrive very early the morning of the 27th, so I'll need a day to recover. Traveling with the Central Conference of American Rabbis. It's our annual convention. Every 7 years, the Reform Rabbinate, since my rabbinical association, has its annual convention in Israel. So I'll be in Jerusalem, followed by Tel Aviv for a few days, and I'll be really busy that whole time because I'm being installed on the board of the organization. So there's just a lot of work. That is not a leisure trip, but I'm really excited. It will be my first time back in Israel in exactly 4 years. I was last there in February of 2019. So because of that, we have today's class, and then we have the next 2 Thursdays, so the 8th and the 15th. And then we're on an extended hiatus. But you'll be receiving word in the weekly e-blast and in the spring bulletin that we're going to come back to a longer form Talmud study class this spring. I believe that we're doing it starting in March. I'm not sure if it's the first week of March, but I think March has 5 Thursdays. So I think the last 4 of those Thursdays in March will be our class. Then we have to kind of work around Pesach, which falls on a Thursday this year. So there will be a few weeks off in April, and then we'll go all through May up until just before Memorial Day. And, assuming it's going well, we'll do what we did last year. We'll do like a mini semester in August or something like that. So we're doing like study in chunks, several weeks at a time, take a few weeks off, come back. Just stay tuned to your weekly e-blast. And if you're ever confused, I'll just make sure that Natalie from the front desk, who emails us with the weekly recording and a few words of summary, keeps us informed about when we are meeting.
Rabbi,
So
did you say the 8th and the 15th?
yeah, of this month.
Those are Wednesdays.
Forgive me, the 9th and the 16th.
Thank you.
Good catch, Sandy. Thank you. Yeah, so I'm just looking at my calendar. So February 9th, yes. February 16th, I believe is a yes, even though it's not on my calendar. I have to change that. And then no to the 23rd, no to the 2nd, and then we resume on March 9th. So March 9th, 16, 23, 30. April 6th is Pesach morning, so no. And then we're back at it starting April 13th, 20th. So you just stay tuned. It's most weeks between March 9th and Memorial Day, with a few exceptions to work around Passover and one or two other commitments that I have that I couldn't move. So generally we're meeting on Thursday mornings at 10:15. Okay, enough on that, my friend. No, you're right. We're not meeting on February 16th because this is a 5-week class. Today is 4 of 5. Thank you. I need my coffee. So Sukkah, Tractate Sukkah. One of the nice things about teaching in my office is I actually have a shas in my office. Now that's another term that we haven't used yet, so I'll introduce you to it. Shas is like an insider's term that refers to the Talmud. You know how I've probably now taught you 5 different ways of referring to the Babylonian Talmud. One is Bavli or Talmud Bavli, or simply Talmud or Gemara. All of these words mean that we're learning Talmud together. Another term that is used is the shas. Shin samech with a little chupchik, which looks like a quotation mark, which indicates in Hebrew notation that you're using an abbreviation. Shas stands for Shisha Sidarim, or the 6 orders. So Shas, or the Vilna Shas, is a particular edition of the 6 orders, which is another way of referring to the Talmud, which, like the Mishnah, is framed along the 6 orders. Anyway, so I have a copy of this gorgeous edition of Talmud. As you can see, Tractate Sukkah, there's a beautiful photo of some indicator of what we're studying here, or you can see right here, Sukkah. This is a beautiful rendering of the Talmud that was published by Koren Press over the last decade. So I've collected it in installments. I now have a full shas on my shelves here in the office. Like on your shelf, it looks really cool. You can just look for the icon and figure out what you're studying. Tractate Sukkah. And then on the inside, it contains the Hebrew and then the English, which is the same translation that Sefaria is using, with the Steinsaltz commentary and incredible footnotes. And it's really the best way to study these days. And then in the back of each volume, oh no, I lied. There are all sorts of, oh yeah, in the front of each volume, you have the actual traditional framing of the Talmud. This is the Vilna Shas. This is the way the Talmud actually looks when you pick up a traditional Talmud with all the Hebrew and Aramaic laid out like so. But I tend to follow with the translation because Talmud is really, really, really hard. So I'm just gonna keep this open to the proper page. The only complex thing about this is it turns from left to right for the English, which I don't love because I prefer to read books that are in Hebrew right to left. But look, I get it. I get why they did it. So it even has cool like illustrations. This is an illustration of what we're talking about today. We'll say more about that here. So this is the Koren edition of the Talmud. It's available on Amazon. Each volume retails for $50, but you can often get them for more like 38 or 40. And a full set, I think, is 36 volumes. So it's an expensive investment. You know, you'll shell out $1,800 or so for a full Talmud, which is competitive. Like, that's what a Talmud will set you back if you want one in print. But it really is an incredible addition to any serious Jewish library. But I also just want to counsel, it took me the better part of 25 years to build a Talmud collection. So it's not the kind of thing that you just have to go out and buy a full Talmud overnight. And then again, there's Sefaria. So if you like Sefaria, one thing you can do is make a tax-free contribution to support the work that Sefaria does. Sefaria is on my personal list of charities just because it adds so much incredible learning and meaning to my life and my study. So anyway, let us go into our text. So we're looking at Tractate Sukkah 51a, toward the bottom of the daf. Daf is Hebrew word for page. And this is where it starts. So we're actually starting with Mishnah. How do we know that this is Mishnah? Well, very easily. We've got this word here, which is always in the Talmud rendered in very large boldface, matani, or matanim, which means it was taught in the Mishnah. Matani is just the Hebrew word, the Aramaic word for Mishnah. We talked a little bit about the Aramaic language over the last few weeks. Tavs and shins are transposed, dalits and zayins are transposed. It's a funky language, but matani just means, oh, we're looking at Mishnah. And as we've discovered, the Talmud, the Babylonian Talmud, is a dialogue across generations between a stratum or strata of Jewish text called Mishnah, which we've been studying for many years, and Gemara, which is the later collection of commentary on the Mishnah. And it just goes Mishnah, Gemara, back and forth like that. Mishnah is always more compact. Gemara is always more expansive. So we're starting with a Mishnah. And Mishnah is almost always written in the Hebrew language. Mi shelo ra'ah simchat beit hashoeva. Okay, so mi is Hebrew for who, W-H-O, who shelo ra'ah, who, the one who has not seen, ra'ah is to see. Simcha, a word that many of us know, which means to rejoice, a simcha, right? Beit hashoeva literally means the house of the drawing of water. So Simchat Beit HaShoeva is an ancient festival, which they call here, one who did not see the celebration of the place of the drawing of the water, or the festival of the water drawing. This is an observance, as we're going to learn, that is part of the biblical observance of Sukkot. In ancient times, Sukkot was the principal holiday of the Jewish calendar. So much so, and this will really rock your world, that Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur were really just a prelude to Sukkot. In biblical times, Sukkot, or as the rabbis referred to it, Hechag, which means the festival, it's the big one, was the time of year when the fall harvest would be celebrated at the ancient temple in Jerusalem. I guess it wasn't ancient in ancient times, at the temple in Jerusalem. And more sacrificial offerings were performed on the altar by the priesthood than at any other single festival time of year. In preparation for this big Gigundo festival, which was also a pilgrimage festival, meaning pilgrims were invited or expected to travel from far and near to the temple in Jerusalem with their sheep or oxen or with money to purchase animals and other products for sacrifice in the vicinity of the temple in Jerusalem, which is why even today, the Holy Temple Mount, where the Kotel, the Western Wall is surrounded by marketplaces. Then as now, there's commerce and religion are bedfellows. Because it was a pilgrimage festival, people would travel from far and near and would offer up their sacrifices at the temple. In preparation for this great festival every year, there was a separate observance 5 days before Sukkot, where the altar would be purified. That is the origin of Yom Kippur. Yom Kippur was originally a purification observance for the priesthood and the altar. It later, after the temple was destroyed, the rabbis transformed Yom Kippur into an observance of spiritual purification for the human being, for the Jew, for the individual. And the altar is this, the soul or the heart, right? So Yom Kippur was not anything more than, originally this is, a lead up to Sukkot, where you would welcome the new year, and then 10 days later, you would purify the altar for Sukkot. Obviously, in a world without the temple, all of these holidays get reimagined, rearranged, and evolved dramatically, which is actually the macro subject we're going to be taking up today. So part of Sukkot as an agricultural festival was that it is poised on the boundary between the dry season and the rainy season in Israel, or summer and winter. Those of you who are familiar with Hebrew liturgy, with traditional Jewish prayer, are familiar with certain lines that change depending on what season you're praying. So the prayer called the Givurot, which is the second prayer in the Tefillah or the Amidah, the standing prayers, the big central prayers of any service, morning, afternoon, or evening, which means your might is great, Adonai. You give life to all, or you give life to the dead, depending on how orthodox you are. Great is your saving power. The next line is Mashiv haruach umorid hagashem, which we pray in winter or the rainy season, which means bring down the rains and bring about the strong winds, or you are the one who brings about the rains and the strong winds. In the summer, we say morid hatal, which means the one who brings the dew, the soft, gentle dew. And that is a reflection of the fact that in Eretz Yisrael, there are really only two seasons, wet and dry, rain, winter and summer. So in winter, we pray for the wind and rain, and in summer, the dew. But it would be highly irregular during summer to have strong rainstorms in Israel. It does happen. It's just pretty dry for a long time from, April, Pesach time until Sukkot. Sukkot to Pesach is winter. Pesach to Sukkot is summer. That's generally how it goes in Israel. Because of that, Sukkot was, in addition to being a celebration of the fall harvest, which was the great harvest, the harvest at the end of the growing season, and because Sukkot anticipates the rainy season, and because rain is needed for next season's crops to flourish, most of the traditional prayers that are exclusive to Sukkot have to do with water. Even the waving of the plants, the lulav and etrog, is probably derived from pagan ceremonies where the gods of rain would be propitiated by waving produce around, as if to say, point to the skies, bring back the rain, O gods, so that the nice plants that I'm holding in my hand will flourish for next season. And many of the prayers, the Hoshanot, the so-called Hoshana prayers or the petitionary prayers of Sukkot, originally have to do with, please God, bring back the water. We've had enough dry season. The summer drought is killing us. But here we are celebrating our fall harvest. We need to make sure the rains come back so that next year we'll be able to do this again. That's the underlying nature themes of Sukkot. And that's, among other things, why when you dwell in a sukkah, you have to make sure that the roof is permeable, because you actually want rain to come in. You don't want to drown, but you want to make sure that you can perceive the bounty of nature as expressed through rain. And one last thought on this. This is all tied to the, Israelite religion is very much of a certain time and place. And unlike ancient Egypt, Israel has no natural source of freshwater irrigation. The Egyptian agricultural economy is entirely based on the flooding of the Nile and the way in which ancient Egyptian civilization was able to harness and regulate the overflow of the Nile to water their fields. Israel's agrarian economy is entirely unlike Egypt in that it is entirely dependent on rainfall. So Israelite religion is very much centered around the necessity of rainfall. All of that by way of saying there was, and in some communities still is, a special celebration after the first day of Sukkot. So Sukkot begins at night, and then you have the festival in the morning. And then when the sun sets at the end of the first day, you have a festival called Simchat Beit HaShoeva, which means the festival of the water drawing place. And we're going to learn what that place was and how this was done, but that's what we're talking about. Any questions about Sukkot or where we are in Jewish time, Jewish imagination? Okay. Alan.
Yeah, you just mentioned that we change our prayers from winter to summer based on the second day of Pesach in the afternoon. That's when you switch over.
Right.
But that's the Hebrew calendar. I can't remember exactly, but I think what you're talking about is the rain prayer. I think it's tied to December 4th.
On the English calendar?
Yes.
Yeah.
I have to look it up again, but
look it up. That would be unfamiliar to me.
It doesn't sound familiar.
Mm-mm.
I'll look it up because I know this question always pops up in my head, but it flies out as fast as it goes in.
Let me know. Why are we learning this today? This is important because I don't like there to be too much mystery, though I like to build suspense as our learning proceeds. One of the nice things about not having a set curriculum, but only ideas about what you want to convey over 5 weeks, is that we can kind of go with the flow. And I was so struck by the dialogue that we had toward the end of last week's session. If you haven't seen last week's session, go back and watch it on YouTube, or at least watch the last half hour. I believe it was Aaron who asked a question. And I forgive me, I don't remember exactly how the question was asked, but it prompted me to reflect on what the big project of the rabbis in the Babylonian Talmud is. And I used the term borrowed from actual a term that video game creators and science fiction writers use, which is world building. That it appears to me as a modern reader of the Babylonian Talmud that the Babylonian Talmud is a sustained effort in world building, building a world out of words and Jewish norms for living in a foreign country, detached from all of the physicalized elements of Israelite religion, namely temple and priesthood and holy city of Jerusalem. Well, by extension, by the way, the entire agricultural agrarian economy of Eretz Yisrael is also a physicalized expression of Judaism. Everything I've said up until now this morning about rain and Sukkot and what Sukkot was really all about is so tied to living in the land that now we have a Talmudic rabbinic community uprooted from the land by hundreds of miles and reestablishing norms for Jewish life in an environment that is where the religion of their ancestors is entirely inaccessible to them. Right? So they have to reconstruct what Judaism means in a foreign country with none of the physicalized norms of Jewish practice that their ancestors were familiar with. So a lot of this is like an exercise in world building or imagined memory, imagined collective memory. And a lot of what they propose here, there's no way of knowing whether or not it is historically verifiable. In fact, I generally believe that a lot of what we're looking at is just merely a reflection of the literary imagination of the rabbis, combined with traditions and folklore and memories that were passed down orally and then written from generation to generation. So what we're going to look at next is a sustained effort in this kind of imagined world building. And what are the rabbis trying to say about what it means to be Jewish in Babylonia in the centuries after the destruction of the temple? That's today's exercise. That's today's learning. But I want to give credit to Aaron for asking a question that prompted me to want to think more deeply with us, with our learning community, about this very issue. And I found there are countless passages that exemplify exactly what I was trying to describe last week, but I think none more compelling than the one we are learning today, where we're talking about an ancient festival through the lens of this kind of imagined collective memory. And there are many places in Tractate Sukkah that try to call up the life and times and geographies and architecture of the ancient temple. But it's important to remind ourselves that the ancient temple was, in the truest sense, a figment of their imagination, in that most of the rabbis who wrote about the temple never laid eyes on it, because they're living in a time and place that is entirely detached from, dissociated from, a Judaism or an Israelite religion that's centered around temple and priesthood. Does that make sense, my preamble to what we're looking at today now? Okay. Yeah, mom and dad.
I'm kind of confused about the timeline here. When you talk about the destruction of the temple, are you talking about the destruction of the first temple and the Babylonian exile following that, or the destruction of the temple in 70 AD?
So that's a great question. When I am referring to the destruction of the temple as it is experienced by the rabbis, I mean the second temple, Herod's temple, the temple that was built up by Herod, the nominally Jewish, actually he's a convert to Judaism, puppet governor of the Judean province, who was both desperate to placate and please the Jews, but never fully accepted by the Jews. Very complicated figure in both Jewish and Christian story. But the big temple, the second temple, that was destroyed by the Romans in the year 70. That is the kind of primal trauma out of which the Mishnah and the Talmud arise. It is a layered trauma in that it plays on a stored up Jewish memory around the destruction of the first temple in 586 BCE, so 6 centuries before, by the Babylonians, and the later restoration of that temple under Ezra and Nehemiah, after the exiled Jews to Babylonia were brought back. But of course, these things are highly layered. Like, it's all imagined by the later rabbis. And yet the layering of story around destruction of the temple is their primary mythos. I should say that's not true. It's their secondary mythos. Their primary mythos is the original Jewish story of the Torah. An enslaved population goes free by the hand of God. But built up on that kind of foundation is the story of the destruction of the building and the destruction of the first temple, built by Solomon after David, destroyed in 586. Jewish exiles return from Babylonia. Some stay behind, which is why you have a Jewish civilization in Babylonia, even from the 6th century BCE. But the primary trauma that really catalyzes the codification of the Mishnah itself is the destruction of the second temple in the year 70 CE. Okay, so now, one who did not see, this is the claim, and this is all Mishnah, by the way, so this is earlier literature, but it's still post-destruction of the temple. Is it possible that some of the rabbis whose voices are reflected here in the Mishnah saw this? Yes, it is possible. But how much this reflects historical reality with any historical accuracy? That's merely speculative. So one who never saw the celebration of the drawing of the water, lo ra'a simcha miyamav, that's the claim right here. That person never saw a celebration in his life. I'm going to switch to the English. Remember that the boldface is what's actually there. The plain print is interpolated, but we need it all. This was the sequence of events. Okay, at the conclusion of the first festival day, meaning the first full day of Sukkot, the priests and the Levites descended from the Israelites' courtyard to the women's courtyard. So what is being proposed here is that there was a separate, it's called Ezrat HaNashim, literally the women's area or the women's courtyard, that was adjacent to or part of the temple compound, down below, by the way, where they would introduce a significant repair, or a beneficial repair is the Hebrew word here. It says, Lezrat HaNashim umitakenim sham tikun gadol, a big tikkun. You know the word tikkun, like tikkun olam, repairing the world. Gadol means big. So what is this significant repair? Hold that thought. The priests and Levites are going down into the women's courtyard and they're doing some kind of beneficial renovation project. All right, what is it? You will learn. There were golden candelabra, which is the plural of candelabrum. So candelabra is actually a plural. Golden candelabra atop poles there in the courtyard. And there were 4 basins made of gold at the top of each candelabrum. And there were 4 ladders for each and every pole. And there were 4 children from the priesthood trainees. And in their hands were pitchers of 120 log of oil. These are giant vats of olive oil used for lighting lamps that they would pour into each and every basin. So you have to picture these massive drums of oil that are being hauled up ladders to pour into the basins at the top of the branches of the candelabra to light the courtyard, okay? From the worn trousers of the priests and their belts, so they would take the worn out clothes that the priests were no longer using to wear, and they would tear off strips. It says they would loosen and tear strips to use as wicks. So they would take their old linen garments and tear off strips of fabric and presumably twist them around and use them, put them in the basins of now filled with oil. And with them, they would light the candelabra. And here's the claim. And the light from the candelabra was so bright that there was not a courtyard in all of Jerusalem that was not illuminated from the light of the place of the drawing of the water. So this is merely a description of just the light show, right? This is very impressive. And that's why I say, is this historically verifiable? It strains credulity. A claim like, first of all, a claim like if you've never seen this simcha, you've never seen a simcha in your life. And a claim like it was so bright, the lights were so impressive that there was not a courtyard in all of the city of Jerusalem that was not illuminated from the temple up on the Temple Mount. Okay? That's what we're being asked to visualize here, a big public spectacle. Ann Cohen, just unmute yourself kindly.
Where did they get the fire to light the candle?
Oh, I assume that people have known how to make fire with flint for a very long time. They even have found like ancient firestones. So, you know, so even a million years before Jewish civilization, people knew how to make fire.
Thank you.
Either that or there were other torches burning and they could just take the fire from there. Yeah. Other questions? Okay, good. So now back to this festival. So that's just the Mishnah on the lights. That is, this is all from the end of Sukkah 51a. And there's one more line of Mishnah here, actually a few more lines of Mishnah. Chasidim, I'm right here. Chasidim, which means not the Chasids like today's Chasids, but the pious people. The Anshe Ma'aseh, which I would say are the machers of the community. Anshe is people, and Ma'aseh, as we learned last week, is the word that means deed, like a maisa. So Anshe Ma'aseh, the doers in the community, the real machers in the community. Hayu merakedim bifnehem, they would dance in front of them. And it's not clear, probably not in front of the lights, but in front of the people. So all of the machers in the community and all of the religious Israelites would get up and dance. This is all Mishnah. The imagined or recollected, and I say recollected, but memory is, a funny and flimsy thing. So when I say memory, Jewish memory is equal parts legend, imagination, actual memory, storytelling. This is the story. The people would get up and dance. Now we're on 51b. Why are we on 51b? Just because we ran out of room on 51a. The sides of the page don't matter. They're just there to help the reader figure out where you are. Jessica, chime in, please. Just unmute yourself first.
So my question is, it says it danced before the people who attended the celebration. Were women allowed to attend the celebration?
Well, that is very interesting. The answer is apparently yes, until proven otherwise. I'm going to just press you a little bit, even though this is not a trick question. What makes you ask that question? In other words, what's the dilemma about this practice that makes you want to ask?
Well, you just said the religious men and the men of doers, if they're dancing. I've never, every time I've been to a religious celebration, the women and the men have been separated.
Excellent. Thank you. Yes, that's exactly the answer I thought you would give and I was looking for. And I don't like to play guess what the rabbi is thinking, but sometimes it's fun. I had a feeling that we were thinking the same thing. Yeah, most of us who are familiar with the norms of Jewish life as defined by the rabbis would have a little bit of cognitive dissonance around this image of the pious Jewish men dancing in a mixed gender company. And we know that it's mixed gender because this is taking place presumably in the women's courtyard, which is down below, because it said the priests and the Levites would descend, presumably from up top on the temple. And remember the first thing I said, that we have to hold we have to wait for it, is they introduced a beneficial repair. They did something down there. What is it? We don't know yet. We're going to learn. So hold all those thoughts. And even though it is dissonant for you to do this, I'm going to ask everybody who now feels the dissonance that Jessica feels to hold your dissonance. Like, just hold on to it, let it be there, and acknowledge that, this feels out of step with one thing we know about rabbinic practice of Judaism. Barbara.
I'm curious as to the term Ezrat Nashim. Ezrat is help, Nashim women. So I don't understand.
Yeah, it is. So we're going to look at that word up here. The Ezrat Nashim, or the women's courtyard, is written here. For whatever reason, I believe that the word Ezra in this case, it doesn't give a definition in the sidebar, too bad, comes from a related Hebrew word, Ezur, which means an area. But why it's Ayin Zayin Resh, which definitely means help or helper in Ezer, or the Hebrew name Ezra means the helper. I'm not sure what the relationship is to courtyard, so I need to look that one up.
Could it be medically? Any tie to medical? Maybe that's where they help women. No.
I think that's a stretch. I think that it's simpler than that. I think that it's from the word Ezur, which means an area, but why it is either a cognate. If it's a cognate, I don't know why. If it's a false cognate, then it's a false cognate, but it doesn't appear to be. So I need to look that one up. Thank you for asking. It caught my attention too, but only this morning as we were actually in the moment. I'm like, that's a weird word. So yeah, right now it's a weird word until we look it up. Trish.
I just circling back to the very first sentence, which is talking about the celebration of the place of the drawing of water. So far, I haven't heard anything about the drawing of water, but I'm thinking maybe women's courtyard, wells, water, Miriam, all that stuff. I mean, is that the connection or? No,
but as I said, Sukkot is a water festival originally. It is a festival of propitiating God to bring back the rain. We're going to get to the water. But the main theme of the festival, actually the thing they're all there to do, is to go down to the Siloam, the Siloam pool, and draw fresh water out, and spill it on the ground. There are lots of pagan societies that have ceremonies of spilling water or libation offerings. Libation just means drinking, which are linked to this idea of, hey, God or gods, look what I'm doing. Remember this stuff? Water, bring it back, please. We don't tend to do this so much in modern Jewish practice, but we've retained one water custom for Sukkot, which is the waving of lulav and etrog. We have botanical species, each of which has a different relationship with water. The palm can thrive when there's almost no water. The willow will die within a day of being uprooted from its water source, which is why when you're holding a lulav on day 5 of Sukkot and waving it, the etrog looks fine. The palm tree looks fine. The myrtle looks a little yucky, but the willow is desiccated. And I have actually a fun artifact for us. I saved an etrog this year. And I saved an etrog from Sukkot. So Sukkot, of course, was October, or late September, I guess. No, October this year. Holidays were late, right? Yeah, holidays were late, which is why it was cold in the tent outside. So this is my poor little etrog from Sukkot. It's totally dried up. It still has a nice fragrance, by the way. It doesn't smell like fresh citrus. It smells more like, kind of like bergamot. It smells a lot like Earl Grey tea. And you can use an etrog as a spice box. I had forgotten you should, when it's still fresh at the end of the festival, you stud the flesh with cloves and then you put it out on a windowsill. And, 4 months later, here we are, and you have a natural spice box for Havdalah. So the point is that these things dry up when they don't have water. And so waving fresh botanical species around was probably originally a way of propitiating God, like, hey, bring back the rains, please. It was a rain dance. Sukkot, waving lulav is a rain dance, originally. Very interesting, right? All of our agricultural festivals have their roots in paganism. I'm sorry, am I rocking your world? Maybe I'm not. Okay, so Trish, we'll get to the water drawing. We're just not there yet. This is all the preamble. As I read this passage, I thought of a fun public festival that was introduced about 25 years ago in the city of Providence, Rhode Island. It's called Water Fire. Or Dad, what do they call it in Rhode Island? It's not water fire,
it's water fire.
Water fire, right, in Providence. And Mom or Dad, could you describe what happens at water fire?
Barnaby Evans was the creative brain behind this festival, or actually it's a sundown to nighttime event along the 3 rivers which course through the downtown area of Providence, especially beautiful since its reconstruction in the 90s. And there are iron braziers filled with hardwood logs and a barge, a black barge with black robed people and kind of like a spooky ethereal music playing on speakers, paddle through the river, setting fire to these torches. And so the upshot of this is, for about a mile or a mile and a half along downtown Providence rivers, these braziers burn and you get the fragrant aroma of the hardwood. And it's a very, if I can jump cultures here, it's a very Zen kind of moment. And now it's become a big outdoor festival kind of thing. So I think a lot of its intimacy that it started with is lost, but that's the gist of things.
Are they still doing it?
Yeah, come watch fires burn on the Providence rivers. Yeah, every summer.
In the summer, right? Summer Saturday nights.
Yeah.
And it brings people out, and of course it makes people go to restaurants and shop.
Yeah, they get like maybe 10,000 people out on the sidewalks of downtown Providence, and it's a very chill experience.
So as I read the Talmud this week, I thought of water fire. Because that's kind of what it is. It's all of these torches blazing and they're spilling water. And I'm like, oh, it's the original water fire. And the people would come and they would dance, and it was a big festival. It's like, better than staring at your iPhone on a Saturday night. Okay, so that's and this is a once a year thing, remember, and it's on the biggest festival of the year, where presumably tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, the rabbis imagine, of pilgrims have descended on Jerusalem for the 8 days of Sukkah. That's what's happening here. Okay, so again, we're calling up a world that the rabbis of Babylonia do not have access to in a physicalized way. That would be an understatement. It was torn out from them. And even though we are generations, even centuries down the road, the trauma lingers. And one of the responses to trauma is to tell the story and to build the world again out of words, out of story. And that's what we're doing. Okay. But this gets very interesting. So now we're on 51B, the B side of the daf. Oh yeah, and this is where having an actual volume by your side is nice. So this is an artist's depiction of the celebration in the temple with all the people gathered around, and you can see the torches blazing here and here. So this is such a lovely edition of Talmud. I really do enjoy studying with it each week, even though teaching on Sefaria is in no way a diminished experience of Talmud, in my view. Okay, so speaking of which, let's bring Sefaria back on screen. So, and what were these pious men dancing? And thank you, hold on to Jessica's cognitive dissonance for a little bit longer. They would dance with flaming torches that they would juggle in their hands. There's a comment in the Rashi that says they would each juggle up to 8 torches. So it was this incredibly acrobatic, tall tale, right? So they have these, they're doing tricks with fire, and they would say before them, I don't like that phrase, they would recite or chant passages of song and praise to God, which of course in Hebrew is divrei shirot v'tushbachot. Tushbechata v'nechemata da'amiran be'alma. Tushbechata means praises. It's in the Kaddish. Shirot are songs, and very fittingly, this week is Shabbat Shira, the Sabbath of song. Please, please, please come to WRT tomorrow night or Saturday morning. We're doing a congregation-wide service, which we never get to do, for all ages and stages of life. We have a special guest artist, Chava Mirel, and we're going to have a wonderful, fun, non-traditional Sabbath of song. We're going to make a lot of music. It's going to be awesome. Tomorrow night at 6:15 and Saturday morning. Yes, it will be live streamed, but it's going to be so much better if you can be there. One who has never seen this. Okay, anyway. The Haleviim bichanorot uvinevalim. So the Levites, with their lyres, harps, and cymbals and trumpets, would play countless other musical instruments. So there was a whole orchestra, right? It's Wadafaya. There's music, there's dancing, there's fire jugglers. There are these incredible torches that would light up the whole city. And the musicians would stand on the 15 stairs that descend from the Israelites' courtyard, the upper deck, to the women's courtyard, corresponding to the 15 songs of ascents in the Psalms. I know a lot about this, not because I'm a rabbi, but actually I did my undergraduate thesis at Amherst College on the Psalms, with particular focus on the 15 songs of ascent, or the Shir Hamalot. Some of you may know, if you've ever davened a Birkat Hamazon, the prayer of grace after meals. On Shabbat, it begins with the passage from Psalm, I think, 126, Shir Hamalot Beshuv Adonai et Shivat Zion Hayinu Kechol Mim, which is a song of ascents. When the exiles returned from their exile, they did so carrying sheaves. Those who sow in tears shall reap in joy. That's that psalm. So it's these songs, they're called Song of Ascent. Nobody knows why. Some say it was a physical act of ascent that would be recited, so that there are these steps connecting the courtyards of the ancient temple. And this is a liturgy, a sequence of prayers or music songs that would be recited or chanted or sung with instruments as you were going up and down the steps. He was literally making ascent, aliyah, in the literal sense of going up. as these particular psalms were recited. Other people say these psalms are spiritual ascent psalms. They start on a note of sorrow and they crescendo to a note of joy. Those who sow in tears shall reap in joy. So a different kind of ascent, a spiritual or emotional ascent. Either way, there are these 15 psalms, numbers 120 to 134, out of the 150 that are collected in the biblical book of Psalms, that particularly are associated with ascent. And they all begin with the words Shir Hamalot, which means a song of going up, a song of ascent. And everything else about them that I've just said is merely speculative. What does it mean, a song of ascent? Is it physical? Is it spiritual? We don't know. But the Talmud gives us the literal interpretation that these were the psalms that were recited, 15 psalms, one for each of the steps connecting the courtyards of the ancient temple. Judy Gross. Oh, unmute yourself first.
Got it. This relation of the relating of this festival or this is so extraordinarily pictorial that it's something that incites the it activates the imagination.
Yes.
When you tell a good story, think of details you can picture. This is not only details that describe what it looks like, it's what it sounds like, it's what it feels like. And so when you read this as you're coming out of to help you come out of trauma, there's such a strong, it just impels a strong reaction. So
beautiful. Yes, it's world building.
Yeah.
Thank you, Judy. Lovely. Russell. Oh, unmute yourself.
Unmute.
Yep,
Unmute.
Here we go.
This passage is talking to me about what really is a tradition. What do we mean by tradition? And I think and I love hyperbolic descriptions in scripture or in Jewish writing, as you know. The more hyperbolic, the more extreme, like stoning your kids to death when they misbehave.
Which the rabbi said is the definition of hyperbole, because they said it actually never happened.
Yeah.
In the Talmud says there are several things that the Torah describes that never actually happened. And one of them is nobody actually ever carried out the Torah's proscription against a wayward and slothy and drunken child, which calls for stoning, as you know.
Although plenty of us have thought about it, but
I believe you.
but I say I love the hyperbolic descriptions because it's inviting us to go, especially when they are either so cruel or so extreme or so bizarre or so something. It's inviting us to make sense out of nonsense. And what this is speaking to me is tradition. We think of traditions as looking backwards. But in fact, this is reminding us that traditions are what we create. And when we create traditions, we are effectively completing God's creation.
Love it. I have a book on my shelf. See, the nice thing about being in my office is I can do show and tell. I've got my desiccated etrog, I've got my volume of Talmud, and I also have a book on my shelf here, which I have mostly because of its seemingly salacious title, which I like the title of the book more than the book itself, but it's just a great title. So this book made us, when I first encountered this book, my classmates and I had a good chuckle at it. Rabbinic fantasies. Ooh, where's the centerfold? Well, nope. So, but that's what this is. It's what this writing is. It's a mixture of historical reality with an extraordinarily detailed and colorful layer of fantasy. So there you go. What are rabbinic fantasies? Well, we're reading one today. Okay, Audrey, and then my mom and dad, and then we'll read a little bit more, please.
Okay, this may have no significance whatsoever, but what struck me was that in this particular retelling, the women are below. And when you go into an observant synagogue where the women are separated, they're usually, if not side by side with a mechitza, they're up.
Yep, hold that thought.
Okay.
It's all part of the Jessica conundrum that we're going to get to. Mom and Dad?
not for the first time, I'm puzzled by the disconnect between the number of times Jewish observance for festivals and religious rites is accompanied by joyous music. I mean, everything from Psalm 150 to this passage. Yet, if you showed up at Young Israel of Scarsdale, with a band or with timbrels and cymbals and flutes
on Shabbat
or on Sukkot, you know, or even your shofar on Shabbat of Yom Kippur, you would be, committing a grievous shanda here.
Yeah, or a not so grievous shanda, but it still is. So
why did the rabbis decide to build a fence around the Torah?
Well, there you go. You just answered your own question. It's a fence around the Torah, which means that a secondary restriction is imposed upon the primary restriction so as really to prevent anyone from violating the primary restriction. If there's no problem with making instrumental music on a Sabbath or a holiday that functions like a Sabbath, a cessation from work, the problem is incurring potential repair of your instrument. So your trumpet breaks, then you can't fix it. And so the temptation to fix a broken instrument on the Sabbath would be incurred by playing it. There's also the issue of carrying it, but that's really an issue that you can easily come up with a loophole around. Now I'm going to just give you my opinion is like, I share your opinion that it's a misguided development in the halacha. It may uphold a certain letter of the law, but at the expense of the great spirit of Jewish practice, which is that festivals should be joyful and that music increases joy. And so not being able to make instrumental music on the Sabbath, in my view, is one of the great sins, one of the great errors of modern halachic development. There, I said it. Now, if I had, it would be fun to have an Orthodox rabbi in the room where we could go back and forth on this one, but that's my view. My view is that not to be able to make music on Shabbat violates the spirit of Shabbat and possibly the letter of Shabbat, more than the potential halachic risks that are incurred by making music. Okay, the human voice is a great instrument. That's probably going to be Rabbi Morgenstern's rebuttal. It's like, what are you talking about? There's not one thing deficient about what you can do with your voice without instruments. And I'm like, Bach disagrees. Okay, Michelle Braun.
I will limit this to just an immediate response to that. And we're not talking about Shabbat here. We're talking about Sukkot.
Yeah.
I grew up in a very creative, but self-conscious, shall we say, religious community. And so Simchat Torah we struggled with this, doing the stupid, marching around with stupid little flags and sort of discomfort with the physical. But downstairs in the same building was a liberal Orthodox congregation. And in fact, on Simchat Torah, my friends and I would go there in the evening and in the morning. And let me tell you, it was festive, right? Yeah. And you don't have to go to just all the, the most Orthodox,
right,
Haredi parts of Brooklyn, but I would say modern Orthodox, I'm guessing. And you really do, it is incredibly joyful in a way that the liberal congregations and the Reform are not as comfortable with, and very physical.
Very freilich. I completely agree.
So it's not just about your timbrels.
I thank you so much. I completely agree that we Reform Jews with our American and German Jewish Protestant informed anxieties about decorum are often much too decorous on Jewish holidays. Like, we should not be politely seated when we are supposed to be dancing. Okay, I'm bringing us out of the rabbit hole because I want Trish to see what happens next, and the rest of us too. So finally, the next passage. And this was the ceremony of the water libation. So, but you notice that this part is not actually in the Talmud. It simply says here, like they just say, here's what happened next. But the interpretation here is that, okay, and now you want to know what the actual main event was? All of this was just prelude. The fire and the dancing and the songs and the instruments and the juggling, all of that is a lead up to what happens, the main event. 2 priests would stand at the upper gate that descends from the Israelites' courtyard to the women's courtyard, so like the papal balcony, with 2 trumpets in their hands. When the rooster crowed at dawn, they would sound a tekiah. So this was an all-night festival. And then the next morning, the morning of the 2nd day of Sukkot, when the rooster crowed at dawn, they would sound a tekiah, and then a teruah, and a tekiah. And they who would draw the water when they who would draw the water reached the 10th stair, the trumpeters would sound a tekiah and sound a teruah and sound a tekiah to indicate that the time to draw water from the Siloam pool had arrived. And when they reached the women's courtyard with their basins of water in their hands, the trumpeters would sound a tekiah and a teruah and a tekiah. So big fanfare with the shofar calls, basins of water. When they reached the ground of the women's courtyard, the trumpeters would sound a tekiah and sound a teruah and sounded a tekiah. They continued sounding the shofarot, the trumpets, until they reached the gate through which one exits to the east from the women's courtyard to the eastern slope of the Temple Mount. When they reached the gate through which one exits to the east, they turned from facing east to facing west so they walk out to the eastern, from the eastern gate. They turn around and face the Temple Mount toward the Holy of Holies, the innermost sanctum of the temple, the holiest part of the ancient temple. And they would do this declaration. They would say, our ancestors who were in this place during the first temple, now what's implied here is our ancestors, not 70 AD, 70 CE, but hundreds of years before, the time of Solomon, the first temple, 9th century BCE, 9th and 10th century BCE rather, during the first temple period, who did not conduct themselves appropriately. They stood with their backs to the sanctuary of the Lord and their faces toward the east. So they weren't doing it the right way. They're saying our ancestors had it wrong, and they worshiped the sun, which rises in the east. Remember, this is a dawn ceremony following the night of partying. This is a quote from Ezekiel. They stood with their backs toward the sanctuary of the Lord and their faces toward the east, and they worshiped the sun toward the east. Anyone who knows anything about Judaism knows that is a big no-no. And we, as for us, our eyes are to God. Our eyes face God. Rabbi Yehuda says they would repeat and say, we are to God and our eyes are to God. In other words, what happened to their ancestors? The temple was destroyed. And what is being proposed here is a theology of divine retribution. Our ancestors, they did this the wrong way. They walked out of the temple and literally they turned their back on the temple. They turned, which is both literal and figurative. To turn your back on something means to spurn it. But it also, in this case, means they literally turned their back to the temple. And not only that, they bowed down to the sun, like the ancient Babylonians and Persians, by the way, who were sun worshipers. But the Egyptians, where the chief god was the sun god. But we, in our time, and remember, this isn't the rabbis in their time. This is imagining the Jews of the second temple period. This is what they used to do after the first temple was destroyed and then rebuilt again by Herod. We are facing God. So, and by the way, you want to know why you face the Holy of Holies when you pray? This is why. Is this why to this day you leave the kotel by walking backwards? It certainly is. You don't turn your back on the Holy of Holies. So traditionally, you approach the kotel, I'm standing in front of the Western Wall, I'm retreating, but I'm not doing this traditionally. Plenty of people do that, but watch the Haredi as they approach the kotel and retreat from the kotel. It's like this. Because traditionally, you don't turn your back on the Holy of Holies. Okay, interesting. Sometimes you're reading Agadah, folklore, and you get nuggets of halakha. Sometimes in the Talmud, you're reading halakha, Jewish law, and you get nuggets of folklore. As I proposed a few weeks ago, I don't think the rabbis saw a differentiation between Agadah and halakha. It's just Talmud. It's fused. Okay. So, but that's the imagined ritual. All of that, by the way, is in the Mishnah. You don't even need a volume of Talmud to read that because you can just pick up a volume of Mishnah. But now you can see from the large boldface Gimel Mem, Gemara. And I can see already, we won't finish this passage today, but it'll be brilliant for finishing our intro class next week. I'd rather, as you all know, I prefer to go deep than broad. So Gemara. Now we're in centuries later. What did the later rabbis have to say about the Mishnah? And what they typically do is they go back to the beginning of the passage we're studying, and they say, let's unpack this a little bit further. So everything we've just learned for the first hour of our class today, we're going back. We're going to go deeper. Gemara. Tanu Rabbanan. So the Gemara begins by saying, it was taught in the time of the Mishnah, Tanu being an indication that we're talking about the Tanaitic period of recitation of the ancient stories and traditions. So the rabbis taught, one who did not see the celebration of the place of the drawing of the water never saw celebration in his life. That should be in quotes, because that comes directly from the Mishnah. That line prompts the rabbis to kind of free associate. The free association that comes next is fascinating. So the line from the Mishnah again is, one who did not see the celebration of the place of the drawing of the water never saw celebration in his life. Also, one who did not see Jerusalem in its glory never saw a beautiful city. Also, one who did not see the temple in its constructed state never saw a magnificent structure. So 3 claims are made. Oh, you've never seen a party till you've been to Simchat Beit HaShoeva. You've never seen a city till you've seen ancient Jerusalem. You've never seen a beautiful building unless you saw the ancient temple. The Gemara asks, what is the temple? This comes back to my dad's question. Which temple are we talking about? What is the temple building to which the sages refer? You notice it doesn't actually say that. All it says is what? What? Which? Which temple? Abaye, one of the Amoraim, one of the later sages of the Gemara, said, and some say that it was Rav Chisda who said, this is very Talmudic. Abaye said, but maybe it was Rav Chisda. This refers to the magnificent building of Herod. And you can see here, so here's the question in Hebrew. Maihi, which one? What was it? Which building are we talking about? Because there's more than one temple in Jewish history. Amar Abaye, ve'itame Rav Chisda. So Abaye said, but maybe it was Rav Chisda. Ze binyan Hordos. Hordos, this guy here. Herod the Great. Hordos. No description. We don't need a description. There's only one Herod in Jewish memory. Okay. We good to continue? Okay. Okay, but then it goes on to say, B'mai Banye, and this is Aramaic, by the way, the B'mai Banye, what did he build it out of? So now we're going to really talk about what, if the claim here is that you've never seen a beautiful building in your life, unless you've seen the temple in Jerusalem, by which Abaye, or maybe it was Rav Chisda, explains, we mean Herod's temple. If that is the case, what made it so great? What did he make it out of? All right, and this is what the Talmud explains. And again, this is imagined, presumably, because none of these rabbis was around to see it. It says, Rava said, this guy, by the way, you want to know who Rava is? You just click on his name, from the Amoraim, 4th generation of sages, middle of the 4th century. He tends to be Abaye's conversation and dialogue and debate partner. He learned under many teachers, eventually became the head of the academy in the Chuza, to which he drew many students. That's in Iraq today. He was wealthy and when needed, able to intercede for the Jews with the mother of King Shapur II of Persia. Well, how do you like that? Okay, so this is Rava. Rava said it was stones of green gray marble and white marble, where the Hebrew word for marble, by the way, is this word, marmara, or marmara. So marble. Some say it was with stones of blue marble and white marble. So this is fascinating. They're really getting into, like, you know, when Kelly and I were redoing our kitchen, we spent a lot of time at the stone yards of New Jersey, which are probably run by the Eastern European mafia, but that's a different story. And they, you know, and you get to choose what kind of nice stone. You've probably done this yourself. You get look at all the different granite samples. It's fun. So was it blue and green, or green and white, or was it blue and white? Okay, but here's an interesting thing. It says the rows of stones were set with one row slightly protruded, like this. So layers of stone slightly protruded, and one row slightly indented. So you'd create this kind of stacked with a lot of texture kind of configuration so that the plaster would take better. He thought to plate, Herod this is, thought to plate the temple with gold, because that would be a very Herod thing to do, wouldn't it? But the sages said to him, the rabbis of the time said, leave it as it is. Do not plate it with gold, because it's better this way. With the different colors and the staggered arrangement of the rows of stones, it has the appearance of the waves of the sea. So it looks so beautiful. It's an astonishing little, I mean, it's so Talmudic to get to this level of detail about something that no one ever saw. But okay, moving on. Tanya, meaning back to the Mishnaic period, with a teaching that's called a Baraita, which is kind of Mishnah, but cutting room floor Mishnah, never made it into the Mishnah, but contemporaneous with the writing of Mishnah. This is the passage that I warned us about. So here's where things really get really interesting. And this is where we'll go till the end of today, and then we'll pick this up next week as we imagine this world. All right? So just make sure you're seated for this, because this is hard. Not hard intellectually, but it's hard emotionally. Maybe it's hard intellectually. Here we go. So we're still talking about imagined buildings, or buildings that are important to the collective Jewish consciousness centuries and centuries later. It is taught in a Baraita that Rabbi Yehuda says, one who did not see the great synagogue, and this is a Greek loan word. The word used for great synagogue is a diopflustion. I can't even say it because it's not a Hebrew word. Diopflustion, this word here, really weird word. Barbara knows that's not a Hebrew word. Just look at it. Doesn't look anything like Hebrew. A diopflustion shel Alexandria. Alexandria is a word we know, shel Mitzrayim, which is in Egypt. So one who did not see the great diopflustion, which is this massive synagogue of Alexandria of Egypt, never saw the glory of Israel. That's a fascinating claim, by the way. Remember, everything we've been discussing thus far imagines Jerusalem. Now we're back in Egypt, but post-Exodus Egypt. Egypt contemporaneous with Herod's temple. There was apparently a special kind of synagogue called the diopflustion in Alexandria. They said, and we know that there was a significant community in Alexandria even after the Jews left Egypt under Pharaoh. Jews have lived in Alexandria for centuries before they were in even, or during the time that Jews were in Eretz Yisrael, there were Jews living in Egypt. And Alexandria was a main seat of the Jewish population. Okay. They said that its structure was like a large basileki, or basilica. Here's that word in Hebrew, basilke. You can even say basilke or basileki. Gedolah, big, really big basilica, with a colonnade within a colonnade. At times, this is an astonishing claim, tall tale stuff here, there were 600,000 people and another 600,000 people, doesn't say men, just 600,000 times 2 in it, which is twice the number of people who left Egypt. So a building that could contain 1.2 million people. Surely you say, this passage must have been written by Donald Trump about his inauguration crowd. No, sorry. All right, it strains credulity that 1.2 million people were coming to shul. I'd like to know how they managed that, but that's fine. Like, we have a hard enough time figuring out how a few hundred are going to get to WRT. Like, I want to know, what was the parking lot like? All right, I jest. Let's move on. In it, there were 71 katedraot, or golden chairs, which corresponded to the 71 members of the Great Sanhedrin, the ancient Jewish court, each of which consisted of no less than 21,000 talents of gold. massive solid gold thrones, 71 of them. What is being conveyed here, I'll ask you in a minute, but just hold all of these images in your mind. Judy Gross, this is no different than the way in which the festival of the water drawing is depicted, or the temple in Jerusalem with its protruding and indented layers of marble of different colors. All right. And there was a wooden platform at the center. What's the word for platform? You probably can guess. It says uvima. There it is, a bima. There was a bima, shel eitz, made of wood, the emsaita, in the very center. So there was a giant bima in the middle, like an Orthodox configuration, by the way. You go to an Orthodox shul, bima's in the middle. Go to a Reform temple, typically bima's up front. All right, so there was a bima, and the sexton, the Hebrew word for sexton is another word you know. Here, it's this word. Anyone see it? It's a chazan, the chazan. Not so much like the cantor today, more like the gabbai, but a synagogue functionary, probably a lay person with special skills. The sexton of the synagogue would stand on the bima with scarves in his hand. So he'd have these huge, not like little, like big flags, okay? There's my pocket square today. So, but much bigger. He would have these incredible scarves to be seen. And because the synagogue was so large and the people could not hear the communal prayer, no microphones, when the prayer leader reached the conclusion of a blessing that required the people to answer amen, the sexton would wave the flag, wave the scarf, and all the people would answer amen, therefore fulfilling their ritual requirement of participating in prayer. All right. That is the Talmud's way of saying there once was a building that was very, very big. But how much better is this, right? You want to capture the size of this building? It could seat 1.2 million people. It was so big that nobody could hear. And so the guy at the front of the room or in the center of the room would have to wave a flag so that people could see it and know that that was the time where a prayer had ended and they should say amen. Shall we proceed? Let us proceed. Okay. Now, we learned something very interesting here. The members of the various guilds or crafts would not sit mingled, me'oravin, all mixed up together. Velo hayu yoshvin me'oravin, which means they didn't sit mixed. Ela, but rather, zehavim bifnei atzman, goldsmiths, zehavin are goldsmiths, would sit with themselves, with their own kind. The chasafin, silversmiths, bifnei atzman, with their own kind. The napachin, blacksmiths, bifnei atzman, with their own type. The tarsiim, bifnei atzman. And coppersmiths with their own kind, Vigardiim bifnei atzman, and weavers with their own kind. So by whatever your trade or craft was, you sat with your own type. And it goes on to say, and when a poor person would enter the Diflostion, this giant basilica-like double colonnaded massive synagogue of Alexandria, that person could recognize people who plied his craft. Oh, I'm a blacksmith. I'm going to go sit with the blacksmiths, and he would turn to join them there. So like day laborers who wait to be picked up for a day job. That's what the synagogue used to be there for. And from there, he could secure his livelihood as well as the livelihood of the members of his household. What a nice little detour. Synagogue wasn't just the place you go to pray. It's where you would go to find a job. This is all well and good, but we have to keep reading. After depicting the glory of the synagogue, the Gemara relates. Now, none of that is there, by the way, right? This is all in plain type, which means it's not actually in there. It's just your translator is helpfully. The translator puts a lot of segues in here so that you can just follow. But all you have in the Gemara is Amar Abaye. Okay, enough talking about blacksmiths, silversmiths, goldsmiths, coppersmiths, and weavers. Let's talk about what really happened. Abaye said. I'm just going to do it in the Hebrew. V'chulhu, everyone. Tatlinhu Alexandros Mokdan. Just 4 words. So we've read this whole description. We've been reading it for 20 minutes. V'chulhu Katlinhu Alexandros Mokdan. Alexandros Mokdan is Alexander of Macedonia. Presumably Alexander the Great, though it was pointed out to me by, I listened to a Talmud lecture on this passage this week as I was preparing for today, said there's a timeline problem that the Jews of Alexandria and Alexander the Great might not have actually intersected, but okay. The rabbis imagined that Alexander the Great came along. Oh, I forgot to tell you what the verb is. So, V'kulhu katlinhu Alexandros mokdan. Alexander the Great massacred all of them. That's the line. Abai said all of the people who congregated in that synagogue were killed by Alexander the Great of Macedonia. The Gemara asks, what is the reason they were punished and killed? It is due to the fact that they violated a prohibition with regard to Egypt. In this verse from the Torah, from Deuteronomy 17:16, you shall henceforth return no more that way. And yet, in violation of God's dictum, the Jewish people went back to Egypt. So as the Jews are preparing, as the Israelites are preparing to cross into the promised land, that's the setup for the book of Deuteronomy, Moses' final set of directives to the Israelites. Before Moses dies, you're going to cross over the River Jordan, you're going to go into the promised land, you're going to overtake the people who live there, and you will inherit this land that was promised on oath to your ancestors. One of the lines in that book of Deuteronomy is, don't go back that way anymore. God has delivered you from Egypt. Don't be like Lot's wife. Don't look back, don't go back. There's only one way for you to go, and that's forward into the promised land. And yet, and this is historically verifiable because we have archaeological and textual evidence outside the Bible, Jews did go back to Egypt. We know that I was in Cairo, I didn't get to Alexandria, but the Egyptian government, in collaboration with the Israeli Ministry of Tourism, pre-COVID at least, was working on a significant initiative to restore ancient synagogues in Egypt to attract tourists from Israel, and was opening up. And I went with a group of American rabbis and our spouses or partners to do a sample Jewish itinerary in Egypt. It's really hard to believe this. This was 2 weeks before lockdown. It was February break of 2020. Absolutely incredible trip. I don't think it was quite ready for prime time yet. Someday I hope we can take WRT to Egypt. It really is amazing. And one of the things that we were most impressed with, but also sad about, is how much money Egypt is pouring from its antiquities department, which of course is incredible, into restoring ancient synagogues. The problem is there are no Jews. The city of Cairo has 8 Jews left. I met them. I met about 4 of them. There's a sexton of an old synagogue who's about 90 and his kids. We met that family. And there's like one other family. Everyone else left or was forced out in the Nasser years. Like so much of the Arab world kicked out its Jews and they went to Israel in the 50s and 60s. That was a second Jewish diaspora, or a third or a fourth or a 20th in the 20th century that is often under-acknowledged. Having said that, fascinating being in Egypt. And the same weekend they were there were a bunch of Jewish dignitaries from all over the world to mark the dedication of a renovated synagogue in Alexandria, not the Deflustion. I don't know if there's archaeological evidence of this particular structure. Anyway, so in the last few minutes, I'd like you to comment here on what you think this is all about. I have one observation that I made, and I've read this passage many, many times. And Jessica and Trish and others who want to know about separating men and women, that's next week. So I haven't forgotten you. When we finally get back to the Festival of the Water Drawing, and this is very Talmudic, it's going to get back to the topic at hand. We're just on a long digression now. It will talk about the separation of men and women and what that means. So you got to come back next week. Sorry we didn't get to it today. But Steve, do you want to comment here? This is a devastating passage, is it not?
Well, yes, it is. But as you pointed out, timeline, it's fanciful. So less devastating in that sense, more political. I think it's more a political statement where you have the homes of study, sort of comparing themselves to their recollections to even what the building of the Aron HaKodesh in the Bible, in the intricacies that they describe, but that somehow, Yavne is good, Alexandria is bad.
Yeah.
Because there was a huge community in Alexandria, as you pointed out, and there was a lot, and there was a lot of interplay with early Christianity there too.
Thank you. And so there's clearly a pro-Israel or pro-Eretz Yisrael polemic dimension to this, right? The polemic is against Jews living not just outside the land of Israel, but in Egypt specifically. Of all the places, again, it's kind of a macro iteration of don't turn your back on the temple, right? Think of that as one of the organizing metaphors for the whole passage. The Jews who turned their back on the Beit HaMikdash, on the Holy of Holies, on the Kodesh HaKodeshim, and therefore were destroyed for it. And similarly, to move back to Egypt after being liberated is turning your back on everything that God has done. As I often joke, the first line on God's resume, there are many passages in Jewish thought that I call God's resume passages, where basically all of the accomplishments of the God of the Israelites are recited in some public or liturgical setting. Resume item number one is, oh, by the way, I freed you from Egypt. Like, if you need to be reminded what has God done for us, quote unquote, lately, freed you from Egypt is always number one. So to go back to Egypt is a middle finger, is a thumbing the nose at God, or to use the metaphor of today's reading, it's turning your back on God and walking away from everything God has done. Other comments here, Michelle, Mom, Dad, Barbara, please.
Okay, as the parent of a fantasy novelist who obsesses every day about world building, I appreciate your constructing it that way, and also, what the rabbis did to do that. So I have an interesting conflict here, because on the one hand, they are Chutz La'aretz, they're out of the land, or at least out of Jerusalem. They're trying to rebuild something when they don't have the physical building. Yeah. And yet they're also condemning some of the people who are part of that. So yes, we're back to Steve's, political statement there, but also, the tension in all of that. I'm also trying to remember that this came in context of Sukkot, which was the pilgrimage festival, right? Nice. So when you at least have to come back periodically to do that. But nice. I want to end this as a question. When was the settlement in Elephantine? Wasn't that earlier?
I believe so.
So this is not, it's not just,
I think 6th century BC. Norm Weiss probably is our expert. I'm not sure Norman is here today to talk about when the Jews settled in Elephantine, Egypt, but we can find that out. Let's find out.
I think it was actually during when many of the Jews were in Babylon. There was this military garrison.
That's what I thought. So that's much earlier. So this is not a new, well, we've had many conflicts in this.
It is ironic, Michelle, just playing off your theme here, what I want to highlight from what you just shared in the form of a question is the cognitive dissonance that we should feel at a community of diaspora rabbis writing a polemic against diaspora Jewry. But in Babylonia, so it's really, oops, I just turned my screen off. Sorry about that. In Babylonia. So it's really interesting that these diaspora Jews in their polemic against diaspora Jewry are writing it from the sake of from the standpoint of diaspora. It's very layered, very ironic. Let's do Mom, Dad, and then Barbara.
I read this as a cautionary tale. And as the way this is constructed from a literary point of view, this is almost like, worthy of a Stephen King novel. Mm-hmm. all of which precedes is the glories of these various edifices and the amazing things that took place there. It's kind of like, well, if you saw this, you didn't see that, but wait a minute, let me tell you about this one. Oh no, well, you didn't really see anything. Let me tell you about this huge synagogue, and in a heart flash, you were all wiped out.
Yep.
And this coming from a bunch of rabbis who had no physical edifice. These things had been destroyed. These weren't there anymore. So this is all imaginary, and the lesson seems to be, before you get so enthusiastic about your meeting places, for instance, think about the important message here, which is to adhere to your gods, to what God's commandments are.
Beautiful. Love that drush. Love that way of seeing the message in the text here. Yeah. Don't become too attached to your buildings. Right? That's not what Judaism is about. That's another way
coming from a bunch of rabbis who have had all their buildings destroyed.
Exactly. Beautiful.
The reality for these rabbis is that if Judaism had remained a sacrificial cult, it probably would have ended up on the ash bin of history instead of a world historical force.
Beautiful interpretation of this passage. I love it. And by the way, all of these interpretations coexist, perhaps uncomfortably. I actually think that there's a kind of symphony of ideas that we're generating around this passage, each of which has its own, melody worthy of being heard. I want to add here that the fragility of the Jewish community is also acknowledged in this text. Like, even at our height, 4 words and we're wiped out. Just, it evaporates in 4 words. And the literary art of building this world and then tearing it down in 4 words should not be overlooked. The carefulness, the artistry of the writing of the Talmud. It's not just thrown together. Those 4 words about Alexander massacring everyone. It really is gut-wrenching. I think it's so effective as literature. And it's probably poignant and important for us to have this conversation, which appears to be about Sukkot, but 2 things. So isn't this a Groundhog Day conversation, thinking about the movie, about reliving our past and reliving our past and reliving our past, and what are we going to learn from it? And also, isn't this an important conversation after a massacre at a synagogue in East Jerusalem and an attempted Molotov cocktail bombing of a synagogue in New Jersey? Like, we're not that removed from the concerns and considerations of the Talmudic rabbis, even now. Barbara and Russell, please.
My husband's family was kicked out, of course, and found themselves in Portugal. And then in 1492, they were kicked out of Portugal, and they found themselves back in Egypt. But the Egyptian government welcomed them.
Right.
And now, the past year, they've gone back to Portugal, and where they've been given citizenship and birth certificates that they were originally Portuguese citizens.
Yeah, as a part of the long overdue penitence of the Spanish and Portuguese governments for for the very successful removal of Jews during the period of the Inquisition and the expulsion.
But in the meantime, my father-in-law sat for 2 years in prison in Egypt when Israel was founded because he was Jewish.
Wow, fascinating. Thank you for sharing your family history with us.
Mm-hmm.
Russell.
We're focusing on the buildings and not being attached to buildings, but I see this passage equally about choreography.
Mm-hmm.
And it is so specific about who stood where, the fact that different occupations sat together and the women as place. And is this passage also telling us that the Jewish sense of place is what we make it, what we define it to be, as opposed to a sense of place? The fact that the past is conflated with the present and the future, the aspiration for a place in Jerusalem, the idea of pilgrimage, is it really telling us that the sense of place is choreography? It's where we put ourselves.
Love that. Right. There are many surrogates that the rabbinic imagination brings for the physicality of place. And ritual choreography, prayer, music, storytelling, text, study, all of these are part of the vocabulary and the norms of Jewish life and practice that come to substitute for the physicalized Jewish enterprise in a building with a hereditary priesthood. So beautiful comments, everyone, beautiful observations. Please don't despair of not having answered the question about women and men dancing together. We're going to get there next week, I promise. That's where the text returns. So it's interesting, like after this incredible, mind-blowing, what amounts to be a digression, the Gemara will simply kind of like stop at a certain point. We'll do a little bit more Gemara next week, right where we left off here in Sukkah 51b. And we'll look at, it'll say, oh, back to the Mishnah, back to the festival of the water drawing. And remember, I gave us a teaser that now becomes a week-long cliffhanger. Remember I said that what we said when we looked at the very first line was that the Levites would descend from the deck of the Israelites down to the women's courtyard. And there they introduced a beneficial or a significant repair, a tikkun. They did something, they did a renovation, but they didn't tell you what it is. We're going to get to what it is. So all of this is linked, by the way. You can, of course, read ahead if you want, or you can hold yourself in surprise until next week. But I'm really excited to have encountered one of my favorite passages in Talmud with you today, and for the robust discussion that accompanied this. So I'll wish you a wonderful week. Please come this weekend. This Shabbat Shirah, Sabbath of Song, is going to be very joyful at WRT, both Friday night and Saturday morning. You can come to both, you can come to one, but it's all going to be really nice with Chava Mirel. Bye, everyone.
Is Saturday morning in the CJL?
No, I think Saturday morning's in the sanctuary. Though, no, it's in the social hall. Social hall. We're doing it kind of in the round.
In the round.
Yeah,
I knew it was going to be in the round. That's why I was
it's in the round. See you, folks. Bye.
Well, look about John.
All right, thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you.